I knew the second Craig Williams leaned back in that overpriced ergonomic chair, lips curling like he just won some petty office duel, that this was going to be one of those days people gossip about for years. His voice carried that smug, lazy confidence of a man who thought job titles were personality traits. Badge, laptop, and dignity on my desk now. No preamble, no explanation, just a public execution in front of Linda Parker from HR to wide-side junior analysts who froze like they'd stumbled onto the end scene of a crime show. He even paused after dignity like he was expecting a laugh track. I'm Brandon Miller, by the way. 48 years old, been keeping this place running for 22 years since the days when we were still using dial-up modems and thinking Y2K might actually end civilization. And I didn't give him the satisfaction of a quip. No pleading, no bargaining. I took my badge off with one smooth motion, set it next to the laptop I'd already powered down, and, for good measure, placed my coffee mug beside them like I was staging a photo shoot for office clearance sale. The mug had our old company logo from before the 3 rebranding and acquisitions. Craig probably didn't even know what it meant. Then I turned and walked out. The air in the hallway felt heavier, like the building itself knew something was about to shift. I'd walked these corridors for over 2 decades, watching the industry evolve from simple client-server setups to cloud-based everything. I'd seen executives come and go, each one promising to modernize and optimize without understanding that some things worked precisely because they'd been built right the first time. Out in the parking lot, I didn't cry. I didn't fume. I sat in my car, hands on the wheel, feeling oddly clear-headed. 22 years at this place, and this kid minus this resume minus spatting hotshot from some consulting firm that probably charged $500 an hour to tell companies what their own employees already knew minus, thought he could strip me of my dignity with a rehearsed line and a smirk. The insult barely scratched the surface compared to the bigger truth. He had no idea who he just fired, because buried under the polite, polo-shirt wearing employee they'd known all these years was someone who had quietly, methodically built the skeleton key to the entire operation. Their secure portals, every encrypted handshake that made the company tick minus, it all passed through a service called Secure Flow Systems. A service I had founded back in 2003 during the early days of enterprise authentication. When most companies were still using shared passwords and hoping for the best, and tucked neatly into the master license agreement, written in black and white with the kind of legal precision that comes from watching too many companies get burned by sloppy contracts, was a clause so simple it should have been impossible to miss. The license was valid only while I remained employed there. Terminate me, and the license terminated with me. I pulled out of the lot slowly, almost savoring the thought. It wasn't revenge yet, not exactly. At that moment, it was just a reminder to myself that the game wasn't over. It was barely starting. The company might not feel the ripples today, but they were coming. And when they hit, they wouldn't be ripples anymore. They'd be waves. Driving home through the familiar streets of our mid-sized tech hub not quite Silicon Valley, but trying hard to pretend I thought about how many times over the years I'd fixed things in the shadows. Locked out accounts at 3 a.m. on a Sunday when some executives suddenly remembered they had a client presentation in Tokyo. Password resets for the same people who never bothered to learn proper security hygiene. Sudden security breaches that could have sunk us if I hadn't been monitoring the intrusion detection systems I'd personally configured back when cybercaserdia was still 2 words. The bosses never remembered those moments, but I did. And I remembered how each thank you from upper management was quickly followed by more work dumped on my plate without more pay. More responsibilities added to my job description without more recognition. More critical systems placed under my care without more authority to actually manage them properly. By the time I got home to my modest split level in the suburbs the same house I'd bought, when I thought this company would be my career for life the anger had cooled into somebody. I poured a cup of coffee from the pot I'd made that morning before Craig decided to play God with my livelihood, sat at my kitchen table, and opened my personal laptop. The machine was older but reliable, much like myself. while Craig and his consulting buddies probably carried around $3,000 Ultrabooks that they used mainly for PowerPoint presentations and expense reports. I still preferred something I could upgrade and repair myself. Call it old minus school. But when you've spent 2 decades troubleshooting other people's technology problems, you learn to value functionality over flash. I logged into the Secure Flow admin panel, running on servers I'd configured in a data center 50 miles away. The interface was clean, utilitarian, built for purpose rather than aesthetics. No fancy graphics or animated dashboards, just clear metrics and straightforward controls. The kind of system that worked because it had been designed by someone who actually understood how authentication protocols functioned at the packet level. The license status showed active, still ticking away because the HR paperwork hadn't yet fully processed on their end. Linda Parker probably had a stack of termination forms on her desk, waiting to be entered into the system sometime tomorrow morning. Standard corporate bureaucracy minus fires someone on a Tuesday afternoon. Process the paperwork on Wednesday. But when she did enter that termination, when my employee ID got deactivated in their HR system, the automated webhook I'd built years ago would trigger. Secure Flow would receive the notification, cross-reference it against the license agreement, and execute a clean shutdown of all authentication services for that client. No malicious code. No data destruction. No angry sabotage. Just a simple business relationship ending exactly as the contract specified. I closed the laptop without making a move. Timing mattered. If I wanted this to hurt the right people minus, not the innocent developers like Scott Anderson who'd been nothing but professional to me, not the administrative staff who were just trying to do their jobs, but the executives who made decisions without considering consequences, minus I needed to let them walk face minus first into the problem. No warning shots, no gentle nudges. Just the inevitable moment where the arrogant smirk on Craig's face dissolved into confusion. Then fear. Then panic as he realized that systems don't run on executive privilege and corporate hierarchies, don't mean much to authentication servers that just want to see valid credentials. I leaned back in my chair, sipping my coffee and let the silence of my apartment wrap around me. For the first time in years, I wasn't tethered to a company phone, waiting for the next urgent message. I could feel my shoulders loosening, my pulse steadying. The chronic tension that comes from being the person everyone calls when technology goes wrong was finally easing. I was free. And they, though they didn't know it yet, were about to learn the real cost of firing the one person holding the keys to their digital kingdom. Out in that sterile office, my badge, my laptop, and my so-minus called dignity were sitting neatly on his desk. But the real leverage, that was still very much in my hands. The doctor home felt strangely weightless, like I just stepped off a ride I'd been stuck on for far too many years. The skyline of our city blurred past minus a mix of old manufacturing buildings being converted into trendy office spaces and glass towers that housed the kind of consulting firms Craig had crawled out of. I wasn't replaying the scene in his office. No slow minus motion humiliation. No mental rehearsals of what I should have said. That wasn't worth my time. Instead, I was thinking about something far more satisfying. Secure Flow Systems. That name probably meant nothing to Craig. It meant everything to me. They built it back in 2003 when I was freelancing between regular jobs, long before this company even knew my name. The tech landscape was different then. Minus companies were just starting to understand that password 123 wasn't adequate security for $1,000,000 operations. At the time, Secure Flow was just a neat little project minus centralized authentication that could scale without breaking. Using protocols I'd learned during my early years working with financial institutions that actually understood security wasn't optional. The system used what we call public key infrastructure minus PKI for short. Think of it like a master key system for a building, except instead of physical keys, it used mathematical certificates that could prove identity without ever transmitting passwords over the network. Back when I designed it, this was cutting minus edge stuff. These days, it's standard practice. But in 2003, most companies were still using basic username minus password combinations that could be cracked by a teenager with a laptop. Over the years, Secure Flow became my ace in the hole. licensing it out under my own LLC while quietly integrating it into every nook and cranny of this company's infrastructure. What started as a simple authentication service had grown into something much more comprehensive, minus a security orchestration platform that handled everything from initial log-in verification to ongoing session management to automated threat detection. Client portals, internal dashboards, code repositories, payroll systems, vendor integrations, backup services, even the smart locks on the server room doors, minus all of it passed through Secure Flow. The beauty was in its invisibility. Most employees never knew it existed. They'd log into their workstations, access their applications, and everything just worked seamlessly in the background. And here's the kicker: buried in the license agreement, right under the section with all the boring boilerplate about service levels and liability limitations, was a clause so clean it could cut glass. This license shall remain valid only while the named founder Brandon Miller is actively employed by the licensee organization. Termination of employment, voluntary or otherwise, will result in immediate termination of the master license with no grace period and no exceptions. Upon license termination, all authentication services will cease immediately, and no technical support will be provided for system recovery. When I first wrote that clause back in 2004, I never expected to need it. It was just a safeguard, a way of ensuring that if a company wanted to use my technology along my term, they'd keep me on the payroll or negotiate new terms. For nearly 2 decades, it sat there quietly collecting dust while I kept the whole system running like a silent janitor of the digital world. Nobody questioned it during the annual contract renewals. Nobody even remembered it existed, which meant when Craig smirked his way through my firing this afternoon, he was swinging an axe through the very branch he was sitting on. The irony was almost poetic. Here was a guy who probably made 3 times my salary, hired specifically to optimize operations and streamline organizational efficiency, and he just created the biggest operational disaster in the company's history with a single careless decision. Halfway home, I caught myself grinning in traffic. Not the polite, tight slipped office smile I perfected over the years. A real one, the kind you get when you know something nobody else does. The sting of betrayal was dissolving, replaced by something colder, cleaner. Calculation. They'd taken something from me today, sure, but they'd also handed me the perfect setup for a checkmate they wouldn't see coming until it was too late. I thought about the infrastructure map I'd drawn up years ago for the security audit committee, minus a flowchart that looked like a spider web with Secure Flow at the center. Every system, every service, every application had an arrow leading back to my authentication platform. If the license died, every arrow turned into a dead end. They'd try the usual tricks when things started failing. IT would attempt to use backdoor administrative accounts, run emergency recover scripts, maybe even call in expensive outside consultants from those big cybercustody firms that charge $1,000 an hour to tell you what you already know. But Secure Flow was built to reject anything without a valid master key, and that key was cryptographically tied to the active license status. The system checked license validity every 15 minutes by sending an encrypted query to my authentication servers, as long as the license was active. The key remained valid, but the moment that license expired, which would happen automatically when HR processed my termination, every authentication attempt would fail with a generic access denied error that wouldn't explain why or how to fix it, and the only way to get that key reactivated was through me. It started earlier than I expected. I'd figured on a full night's grace before the first crack showed, maybe even until mid-morning tomorrow when people started their workday and tried to access systems that had been quietly running on cached credentials overnight. But by 3 that afternoon, my phone buzzed on the coffee table. I glanced over, half expecting a spam call or a delivery notification. Instead, it was a text from Scott Anderson, one of the senior engineers I'd worked with for years. Scott was solid, one of the few people in that place who understood that good systems administration was like being a doctor. Your best work was preventing problems that nobody ever knew could have happened. Hey, can't log in? Weird. No preamble, no context, just that. I could picture him at his desk, frowning at his monitor, trying the same password 3 different ways before giving up and messaging me out of old habit. Muscle memory. For years, when something didn't work, Scott texted me. When servers acted up, Scott texted me. When the network got flaky or applications started throwing random errors, Scott texted me. I didn't answer. Not because I didn't like Scott minus he was one of the good ones. Always treated me with respect. Never acted like I was just the IT guy, even though that's technically what my job title said. But this wasn't his problem to solve, and it sure wasn't my job to swoop in anymore. Besides, this was just the first tremor. The real earthquake was still building underground. A few minutes later, my personal phone vibrated again. This time it wasn't a text. It was a Slack notification, which made zero sense because my company's Slack account had been deactivated the moment I walked out of that building. I unlocked my phone out of curiosity and saw the message sitting there like a little gift from the Universe client portal. Is throwing 403 errors all over. Who's got the admin creds for Secure Flow? This is blowing up. The sender was Danny Foster, one of the junior analysts who'd witnessed my termination. He clearly hadn't meant to ping me minus my personal number. Must have been linked to some ancient contact record in Slack from years ago. Back when we set up the emergency contact system for after minus hours support calls. I imagined Danny frantically typing, hitting send, and then realizing with growing horror that he'd just reached out to the one person their new boss had so publicly thrown out hours earlier. The awkwardness would be delicious if it weren't so predictable. 403 errors meant forbidden access, minus the server was receiving requests but rejecting them due to insufficient permissions. That was Secure Flow's polite way of saying, I don't know who you are anymore, so I'm not letting you in. I chuckled, put the phone face down, and stood up. Time for some tea. I walked into the kitchen, filled the kettle, and let the white noise of water hitting steel fill the silence. They were already panicking about client access, and from the sound of it, the license skill switch hadn't even fully propagated yet. That meant whatever they were seeing now was just the warm minus up act. The beautiful thing about distributed systems is how they fail. It's not like a light switch going off minus, more like dominoes falling in slow motion. Some services would be using cached authentication tokens that might last another few hours. Others would fail immediately when they tried to refresh their credentials. The result would be a confusing patchwork of what worked and what didn't, making it nearly impossible to diagnose the root cause quickly. While the water heated, I leaned against the counter and thought about how predictable this all was. The arrogance of people who think systems run on magic rather than maintenance. The way they never noticed the quiet hands keeping the machine from seizing up until those hands were gone. Craig probably thought technology was like a microwave minus, you push buttons and things happen automatically. He'd never spent a weekend troubleshooting a cascading failure that started with one misconfigured router and ended up taking down half the network. Never sat through a 3 a.m. conference call with angry clients while trying to restore services that failed because someone decided to optimize costs by cutting the redundant systems that prevented exactly this kind of disaster. The kettle clicked off. I poured the water over a tea bag, watching the color bloom through the steam. Somewhere across town, the IT department was probably in full crisis mode now, dragging every spare laptop into the fray, running diagnostics, pinging servers that would respond normally to network tests, but refused to authenticate any actual users. Someone from legal was probably being looped in because when client systems go dark, contracts start whispering ugly things about breach penalties and service-level agreements. The kind of financial liability that makes CFOs wake up in cold sweats. And Craig? I pictured him standing in the center of it all with his arms crossed, trying to project control while his voice pitched higher with every failed update from Martin Cole and his team. I carried my tea to the couch and sank into the cushions. I didn't check my phone again. I didn't need to. The messages would keep coming, each one more frantic than the last. I'd let them pile up like in read mail minus, a quiet monument to the fact that their safety net was gone. Sipping the tea, I felt no guilt. This wasn't sabotage. It was the natural consequence of a decision they made with their eyes wide shut. They wanted my badge, my laptop, and my dignity on the desk. Fine. But they forgot I still own the lock, and they just tossed out the only person with the key. By dawn, The trickle had turned into a flood. I woke to the kind of stillness that used to feel impossible. No vibrating phone at 6 a.m. with urgent emails from European clients discovering their access was down. No pre-minus meeting Slack pings from project managers who'd forgotten their passwords again. Just quiet. I padded into the kitchen, made coffee, and glanced at my phone out of habit. Even without opening any messages, I could see the storm brewing in the previews. A dozen X from numbers I recognized. Another half-dozen from ones I didn't. Short bursts of panic. Payroll locked. VPN dead. Who reset prod? Client calling -can't access portal. Emergency meeting -8 a.m. And my personal favorite, do you still have admin access by any chance? The progression was exactly what I'd expected. First, individual users having trouble logging in. Then entire departments discovering they couldn't access critical systems. Finally, the realization that this wasn't a random glitch but a systematic authentication failure affecting everything that mattered. Across town in that glass box they called headquarters, the real show was underway. By 8:15 every department would be feeling it. Marketing couldn't open campaign dashboards to prepare for the presentation they'd been working on for weeks. Sales couldn't log into the CRM that contained all their client contact information and deal pipelines. The development team was completely locked out of the code repository, meaning no bug fixes, no deployments, no emergency patches. Even HR-smug, always on schedule. HR- couldn't access the payroll system. Linda Parker was probably staring at her screen in disbelief, realizing that the termination she'd processed yesterday had somehow triggered the very disaster she was now powerless to fix. But the worst part for Craig would be the client calls. Our biggest accounts minus the Fortune 500 companies that paid the bills and justified his salary minus would be discovering that their dedicated portals were completely inaccessible. Project managers would be fielding angry calls from C-level executives demanding explanations for why critical business processes had ground to a halt overnight. I imagine the emergency meeting Craig had probably called for 8 a.m. Martin Cole running through network diagnostics that all came back normal. Everything was working perfectly except for one small detail: authentication. The servers were up. The databases were responding. The applications were running smoothly. But without valid credentials, it was like having a perfectly functioning car with no keys. What do you mean it's all tied to one vendor? Craig would be asking, his voice carrying that edge that comes when someone realizes they've made a catastrophic mistake, but can't quite admit it yet. Martin would pull up the secure flow documentation, pointing out integration points that most people had never bothered to understand. Everything routes through their authentication service. User logins, API calls, even our automated backup systems. It's been that way for almost 20 years. So we call them and get it fixed. Craig would snap, trying to maintain his executive composure while the walls closed in around him. That's when someone would have to explain the uncomfortable truth: that Secure Flow Systems wasn't some external vendor they could simply contract with. Was a service owned and operated by the same guy Craig had so publicly humiliated less than 24 hours ago. The call came just after lunch, right when I was halfway through leftover pasta and enjoying the kind of slow, unhurried day I hadn't experienced in almost 2 decades. My phone lit up with a number I knew by heart: the main company line, direct from the fortress of glass walls and bad decisions. I let it ring twice, just long enough to make him wonder if I'd pick up before I swiped to answer. His voice was different, still carrying that sharp edge he thought made him sound in control, but softer now, frayed at the edges like a rope under too much tension. "Hey Brandon," he started, and the use of my first name was immediate proof of how much had changed since yesterday. "We need you to unlock the system. Not could you. Not would you mind helping us out." It was phrased like a demand, but the undertone was pure desperation. The kind of tone people use when they're trying to wrap panic in executive authority. I let the silence stretch just long enough for him to feel it. In the background, I could hear the chaos: phones ringing, urgent conversations. The kind of barely controlled panic that happens when an entire organization realizes it's been running on borrowed time. You'll have to take that up with Secure Flow Systems, I replied evenly. Hey, pause. I could practically hear him gripping the phone tighter, searching for some angle that would give him back control of the conversation. Right, he said, like he was trying to collect himself. We've spoken to them. They said the license is tied to you personally. That's correct, I replied, keeping my voice as neutral as a customer service script. And as I'm no longer employed there, the license has been terminated. Their system is functioning exactly as designed. Another pause, longer this time. I imagined him in his office, surrounded by senior staff and legal advisors, all of them staring at him as the architect of this disaster. So what would it take, he asked slowly, each word measured and careful, to get you to reinstate the service? The question came out grudging, like it hurt to even let the words pass his lips. I didn't smile, not out loud anyway. But inside, I was savoring the complete reversal. Less than 24 hours ago, he was publicly stripping me of my dignity. Now he was essentially begging me to save his career. I'm not in a position to discuss business arrangements right now, I said, keeping my tone professional. You have Secure Flow's contact information. I suggest you work through proper channels. Before he could respond, I hung up. The truth was, that call had told me everything I needed to know. They were past the point of pretending this was a minor outage. They'd hit the wall and realized there was no way over it, under it, or around it without me. I kept my poker face for a reason. The longer they sat in that stew of uncertainty, the better my position became. Every hour that passed was another miss-minus deliverable. Another angry client, another board member asking uncomfortable questions about why their VP of operations had just crippled the entire company. Outside, the winter light was fading, casting long shadows across my living room floor. Inside, I felt no rush, no urge to chase. They'd already made the first move, and it wasn't even close to their last. The balance of power had shifted completely, and they knew it. The only question left was how much it was going to cost them to shift it back. By the next morning, the ripples had turned into tidal waves crashing straight into the boardroom. From what I heard later, through the kind of back-minus-channel gossip that survives any corporate disaster. CEO Peter Hayes had called an emergency meeting at 8 a.m. sharp, not one of those polite, agenda-driven check-ins where people pretended to read quarterly reports while thinking about lunch. This was the kind where people showed up pale and caffeinated, clutching phones that wouldn't stop buzzing because the company's top 5 clients were threatening to walk before the week was out. The meeting started with Martin Cole running through the technical facts in the kind of monotone voice IT directors use when they're delivering very bad news to people who don't understand technology but control the budget. Access failure was now total. Internal tools, client portals, vendor integrations, payroll systems, code repositories minus all dark. Overnight workarounds had failed. Attempts to bypass the vendor authentication layer had failed spectacularly. Even trying to spin up completely new accounts with different providers had failed because too many core systems were hardcoded to expect Secure Flow certificates. Every road led back to one gate, and that gate was welded shut. Then came the part that must have felt like a collective gut punch. Someone minus, probably from the legal department, judging by their attention to detail minus, finally pulled up the original Secure Flow Systems license agreement. No one had bothered to read the fine print in years. It was one of those ancient PDFs buried in a shared document labeled something boring like vendor contracts final F, INALV3 PDF. But there it was, plain as daylight in 12 minus point times New Roman. This license shall remain valid only while the named founder minus Brandon Miller minus is actively employed by the licensee organization. Termination of employment, voluntary or otherwise, will result in immediate termination of the master license. No exceptions, no grace period, no appeals process, no vague language, no wiggle room, no escape clauses. Ironclad legal text that had been sitting there like a time bomb for nearly 2 decades, waiting for exactly this moment. The room reportedly went quiet enough to hear the HVAC system cycling. CFO Richard Stone cleared his throat, already calculating damaged figures that would make shareholders very unhappy. So Brandon was fired yesterday afternoon, he said slowly, like he was working through a math problem whose answer he really didn't want to reach. That's when George Bennett Minus, the oldest board member, a guy who'd been there since the company's scrappy startup days when everyone knew everyone's name Minus, turned in his chair and looked directly at Craig. Why? He asked in the kind of voice that ends careers. Did you fire the only person holding the keys to the kingdom? From what I gathered through the gossip network, Craig tried to play it off. Some corporate word salad about organizational restructuring, operational efficiency, and aligning human resources with strategic objectives. The kind of consulting Minus speak that sounds impressive in PowerPoint presentations but crumbles under actual scrutiny. But the more he talked, the more his voice wavered. Because in that moment, surrounded by Stone Minus-faced executives and increasingly hostile board members, he couldn't dress this up as anything other than what it was: a catastrophic miscalculation that had his fingerprints all over it. Peter Hayes didn't say much during Craig's stammering explanation, but when he finally spoke, his words were sharp enough to cut through steel. Do you have a plan to fix this? Craig mumbled something about IT making progress, about bringing in external consultants, about exploring alternative solutions. Martin Cole, bless his honesty, cut through the nonsense without hesitation. With all due respect, he said, there is no fix without Brandon. The entire infrastructure is built around secure flow. Rebuilding it would take months and cost more than our entire annual IT budget. The silence that followed must have been absolutely brutal. I imagine the board members exchanging those meaningful glances that spell the end of executive careers. The realization settling over them, like wet cement, that they weren't dealing with a system outage. They were dealing with the consequences of firing the one person who was the system. The invitation came that afternoon through George Bennett, delivered with the kind of formal courtesy that barely concealed the desperation underneath. Brandon, the board would appreciate the opportunity to discuss a path forward with you. Would you be available for a meeting tomorrow morning? No corporate bluster, no veiled threats about legal action, just a simple request from people who suddenly understood exactly how much trouble they were in. The following morning, I walked into the same boardroom where Craig had staged his little power play just 3 days earlier. The atmosphere was completely different now, minus dense brittle, charged with the kind of nervous energy that comes when everyone knows someone's career is about to end. Around the long mahogany table sat Peter Hayes, Richard Stone, half the board of directors, and at the far end, looking like he hadn't slept in 48 hours, Craig Williams. The smug confidence was gone. His skin had that pale, waxy look of someone who'd been living on coffee and stress, and when I entered the room, his eyes barely met mine. They gestured for me to sit at the head of the table, minus a small detail that spoke volumes about how much had changed since Tuesday afternoon. I placed my leather folder on the polished wood and opened it, with the same methodical precision I'd once used to troubleshoot their most critical systems. Inside was a single document minus my revised licensing proposal, printed on quality paper with the kind of legal formatting that made it clear this wasn't a rough draft. I slid copies across the table like a poker player laying down a royal flush. The terms were straightforward, and there was no mistaking the shift in power dynamics. New licensing rates minus triple the original fee structure, payable annually in advance rather than monthly. A contract duration of 5 years with automatic renewal clauses that would make it very expensive for them to try this again. Guaranteed employment provisions that essentially made me termination minus proof unless I committed a felony. And in a clause that made several board members exchange uncomfortable glances, a written apology from Craig Williams, acknowledging his misjudgment and accepting full responsibility for the operational crisis his decision had created. That last part wasn't about money. It was about dignity minus the same dignity he tried to take away from me 3 days ago. Peter Hayes picked up the document, scanning each page with the careful attention of someone who understood that every word mattered. Richard Stone was already running calculations, his pen moving across a legal pad as he figured out what this rescue operation would cost. Craig sat frozen at the far end of the table, hands folded in front of him like a defendant waiting for sentencing. It didn't take long. Hayes set the papers down, looked me directly in the eye. and said in a voice that carried no emotion whatsoever, "We'll sign." The pens moved quickly after that, signatures appearing in neat blue ink across multiple copies. When it came time for Craig to sign his portion minus the formal apology that would become part of his permanent Tature record, minus his hand shook slightly as he wrote his name. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just watched the moment he committed, on paper and in front of witnesses, to the most expensive lesson of his management career. When the last signature was complete, I gathered my folder, stood, and thanked them for their time. Professional, courteous, magnanimous in victory. Hayes nodded respectfully. The board members were already turning their attention to damage control. And Craig? Craig was staring at his hands, probably calculating how long it would be before his resume was circulating again. I walked out of that glass building with the signed contract in my briefcase and the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd not only won but had rewritten the rules of engagement in the process. Behind me, I knew Craig's career was effectively over. Not immediately minus, they'd probably keep him around long enough to avoid the appearance of direct retaliation minus, but inevitably. In corporate America, you don't survive a mistake this public, this expensive, this completely avoidable. Outside, the morning air felt crisp and clean. They had their access back. Their clients would stop screaming. Their systems would resume normal operation. And I had something far more valuable than a job. I had respect, security, and the knowledge that my expertise wasn't just appreciated minus. It was indispensable. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. It's proving your worth so decisively that everyone involved learns never to underestimate quiet competence again. The most dangerous employee to fire isn't the one who makes the most noise minus. It's the one who built the foundation everyone else stands on. Because when they leave, they take the ground with them. Sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying your enemies minus. It's letting them destroy themselves while you watch from a position of strength they never knew you had.